Hello! My name is Tristan Registus, and this is a new entry in my occasional Let's Try series. This time I'm taking a look at Anno 1800, so let's get started, shall we? Anno 1800 Thoughts. Recently, I was lucky enough to be in the closed beta for the next entry in the Anno series, Anno 1800. I recorded about 3.5 hours of gameplay and have cut that footage down to about 50 minutes to show some highlights and illustrate some things I want to discuss. Although my commentary won't sync up fully, as most of what I recorded was basic gameplay, and I really want to talk about the new and interesting things in this entry in the series. I also wanted to try doing one of these semi-structured, pre-written commentary type videos for a Let's Try episode, though unfortunately I got slightly delayed as I got a nasty cold in the interim, so this is coming out a bit later than I had hoped. Anyway, enough of my personal life. The TLDR for the closed beta is that I enjoyed it, partly as it was very similar to Anno 1404. I didn't get as far in the game as I was hoping, and the demo is actually capped at around mid-game. This is where it looks like much of the new content really comes in, so I'm keen to try more in the full game. I confess I'm not sure about buying it at full price though. My Anno background. While you watch the basic mechanics in action, I should explain that my introduction to the Anno series was with Anno 1404, which I loved. I'd not heard of the series at all before this game, and afterwards I thought I might be an avid fan, but then things went a bit wonky. The next game of the series was Anno 2070, which I think was generally well received, but something about the near future setting really turned me off for some reason. I also didn't particularly like that you had two parallel tech trees going on. These were the eco and business tech trees. The following game, Anno 2205, was a bit of a misstep all around, I think. It released at a really high price point, and so I didn't buy it immediately. I then discovered from some of the Steam reviews that there wasn't a sandbox mode, and when you combine that with the future setting, I simply didn't buy it. I may pick it up in a sale at some point, like I have the games released before 1404, but then I haven't actually played those either. I confess I'm a little worried that it will turn out that, actually, I only really like Anno 1404.
Rare for promises to be kept. Thank you. The farmers are
Basic
hungry.
mechanics.
You'll have to supply them
Well,
with the
first things first,
necessary,
the footage you're
starting
seeing in the
with
background,
fish.
to start with, is what I would describe as the basic mechanics. You start by building your marketplace, then you build roads to connect things together. You need to build some foresters to gather wood, and a sawmill to chop the wood up into the planks you use as the basic building material. This lets you build houses for your level 1 citizens, who then, in turn, need a fishing hut to produce fish to feed them. Once you build up a certain population size, then they start to demand other goods, basics like clothes as well as luxuries like schnapps to make them happy. You'll also need to build some service buildings like pubs to keep them happy, as well as fire stations for when a fire breaks out, which is basically inevitable. Okay, so anyone who's played an Anno game will be very familiar with all this type of thing, as in essence the basic mechanics are essentially unchanged. There are a few tweaks and differences. For example, in 1404 your citizens would auto-level to the next tier unless you manually switched this off. Here the levelling seems to be entirely under your control, with you having to select each building for upgrade. Production chains. As I've mentioned, I've really only played Anno 1404 properly, so this is the only comparison I can make. Bearing this in mind, the same basic production chain concept used in 1404 is maintained in 1800, though with some key tweaks. And apologies again if these tweaks have also cropped up in any of the other Anno games that I haven't properly played. The first tweak is that the way information is presented has been streamlined somewhat. The game now clearly shows how long each product takes to produce. So it indicates, for example, that a fisherman's hut takes 15 seconds to produce a unit of fish. For chain buildings, where you produce a raw material in one building, then you process it in another, and perhaps process it again in a third, this helps you to work out the ratios more easily. You can, for example, see that one pig farm will produce the required amount of pork to support one butcher making sausages. Although I would note that, with the way the calculation is done, time-based, it can feel backwards. If product A takes 60 seconds and product B, which is made from A, takes 30 seconds, then you actually need 2 of A rather than 2 of B. To me, this does feel a little backwards, though it does make sense when you think about it. It also has an icon now to indicate when a production building has not got enough fields, which is a nice touch. They also have a high degree of variability in the number and size of fields that you build, although I know this was also in 2070. So a farm may require 72 single farm tiles to be built, rather than the 4 blocks of 4x3 tiles, which might have been common in previous games. However, all 72 of those tiles need to be contiguous in order to be a valid placement. Blue Byte also seems to have switched up how supply and demand works. The workers from a later building in a chain will now collect goods from the source, or a warehouse, rather than the source or warehouse delivering the goods. Though I should note I think there were some more subtleties to this, and I didn't dig into it too far. It also seemed to me that production buildings can now satisfy a lot more of the population. For example, I seem to recall that my high population islands in 1404 had dozens of fishermen along the coast, to the degree it looked silly. But I had populations of several hundred on my islands in 1800, supported by only 1 or 2 fishermen. The production calculators that appeared during the closed beta seemed to confirm this. However, I think the fact that people felt the need to make these calculators pointed to one of the lingering problems in the Anno series. This problem is that working out how much of each building you need in order to satisfy your population's demands can be quite difficult. There was a slight tweak to this that might sort of provide a degree of self-balancing to the system, and this change is that buildings now require workers. This suggests that there may be some notion that if you have enough workers in all the production buildings you've set up, then you will automatically be covering your population's own demands. However, this seemed like it was not the case later on, as some of the industrial buildings needed huge numbers of workers, 250 in one case, which would require more food production, but I did not test this out properly. I do know that if you do not meet their needs, then workers now riot, where in 1404 they would simply leave the island. This tying of resources to workers means that any island you want to produce on now needs to have a population, though admittedly I didn't check if there was any mechanism for workers to commute between islands, but this would seem unlikely. In 1404, I had entire islands producing resources, cider and hemp islands for example, and indeed this was often the only way to meet the demands of islands with the huge populations needed to build the cathedral and the mosque in that game. This might therefore hint at why production buildings can now service a larger population, so that you can still have these really big populations without losing too much space to your production buildings.
Red sky morning, shepherd's warning.
Watch your fingers, lads.
I love the smell of dew.
You reached a new milestone.
Industrialisation. The theme for 1800 is obviously the industrial era, and Blue Byte has incorporated this in some very interesting ways. Obviously, it is reflected in the population types. Farmers, workers, and artisans were available in the old world. I don't know what the higher tier population types are, these are actually locked off in the beta, but I'm guessing they're similarly themed towards industrial activities. I didn't actually do any building in the new world, more on that later, so I don't know what the population types would be there. I do know rum is one of the products from the new world, so I assume they will have sugar plantations, rum being a product of sugar, though I'm guessing they'll avoid the whole colonisation and slavery thing. There's obviously quite a lot to this part of the game, though I confess I didn't really get very far in it. Despite the theming, it only really seemed to kick in with some actual gameplay mechanics after I'd been playing for a good few hours and had reached sort of population tier 2 and 3.
Willy Wibbleshock, Self-made man, no shame in it. Wibbly if you like. How it'll be in the fairy tales.
What you...
Look in my eyes. You are feeling sleepy and very helpful. Punctual, please. I do have a pocket watch.
I am the Princess Ching. Please, I am curious about your otherworldly customs.
Flagship at your service. I'm confident it's ready to go.
Newspapers. One interesting aspect in 1800 is the inclusion of a newspaper. This publishes articles based on the events in the game, and these articles provide small buffs and debuffs. The articles are quite closely related to recent events in your game, and I confess I found this a little frustrating at times. I couldn't actually tell whether the newspaper was published on a simple timer, once an hour for example, or was triggered by you hitting a particular milestone, but it did always seem to publish shortly after I'd leveled up my citizens, but hadn't yet put in the new production chain that they required. So I got quite a few articles where it was moaning that I hadn't yet provided canned goods or glasses, but those production buildings had literally just been unlocked. I therefore hadn't even had time to produce them, let alone build the required production chain, and there certainly weren't enough workers available to populate the buildings yet. Admittedly the debuffs were small, a 5% hit to happiness for example, but it would have been nice if these were a bit more forgiving. Looking at the info screens, the population wasn't actually unhappy yet about the lack of canned goods or glasses, so it seemed a bit harsh to be applying a debuff. I would have preferred if the newspaper first published a "Here's this new technology" article shortly after it became available. The next issue could then have applied the debuff if you still hadn't built it. Interestingly, it does offer you the opportunity to edit the newspaper, replacing bad articles with good ones, though weirdly when I looked at the possible replacements some were also negative. I guess the intent was to give you the ability to swap debuffs that would hurt you quite badly with ones that weren't so bad. Although I looked at the options, I never actually edited the paper, and if you publish as is then it will boost your relationship with some of the NPCs. But whether this is the only impact I don't know. I don't know if there are any long-term ramifications for constantly editing the paper for example.
Flagship awaiting instructions. Ordnance plotted.
I am a humble servant of Her Majesty, called upon for delicate occasions such as these.
New orders? On our way. On our way. On our way. New orders? Sails!
Game saved.
We've only a skeletal work gang. Pure pleasure. New unionism is our
Trade
future.
unions.
Us
A new building for 1800 is the trade union. Unions are obviously something that really got going during the Industrial era, but I confess that I found them a little bit confusing here. It wasn't at all clear to me what purpose they were meant to serve. I'd initially assumed they were a population-related effect, so you need to cover your houses with their influence, in the same way you have to cover your houses with the influences of pubs and churches. To me this seemed most sensible because I was thinking about them as more like working men's clubs, places where working citizens could go to discuss union business and socialise. However, it was then revealed that each trade union building has a slot for an item. If you're not aware, items are things you can slot into buildings or ships to provide buffs or debuffs. They might increase the size of a ship's cargo hold, or provide a speed boost, or decrease the cost of running a building type, for example. Well, it appears, given the items for my trade unions that I did acquire, the intent is for them to provide buffs to your production buildings. This means they should be built close to production chains rather than in population centres. Though obviously there may be buffs that help with population as well, but I didn't encounter any. Oh, and while we're on the subject of the trade unions, one thing to note is that in 1404 you were given very clearly displayed areas of effect. The circles around your service buildings showed you which residents were benefiting from their effect, for example. In 1800, this mostly seems to have been shifted to heat maps, with an intensity of green used to show areas that are benefiting strongly and those that are only benefiting slightly. I confess I'm not such a huge fan of these heat maps, and interestingly the trade union building had the clear circle of effect rather than the heat map. I suspect this is again a reflection of the fact that they buff production buildings rather than meeting citizens' needs. You therefore need to know which buildings are strongly feeling the effects of the buff.
About a favour for a favour. It's a simple business, see?
NPCs. As with the previous games, there are a range of non-player characters or NPCs. These fall into two types, the first being what I generally think of as rivals. These are NPCs who are essentially trying to do what you are doing, building up islands, increasing their population, making money. They are, in essence, your competition. The second type of NPC are what I sometimes refer to as officials, though they are not always official. These NPCs mostly have their own islands, though some are more like advisors and they don't have islands, but those islands are not places you yourself can settle. They are intended as a source of trade and quests, and most are neutral, though some, like the pirates, are automatically hostile. Again, these are pretty much as per previous titles, though I'll discuss some of the more interesting aspects later. One thing I did note is that some of the quests are a bit unusual. I had one to take a photo of a ship, for example. However, most seem to be of the usual type. Pick up stuff from the ocean, deliver some goods to a place, escort a ship, or destroy a ship. And speaking of quests, I encountered quite a few bugs with them, which was a little scary. The range of issues I had was also a little worrying. For example, there was an escort quest that wouldn't start. I clicked on the ship to escort and nothing happened. And one quest I completed, it wouldn't let me hand in. However, the worst was a find person quest. If you're unfamiliar, the find person quests in Anno are a bit of a pain. It generates one or more special citizens in one of your towns and expects you to scan through the streets, find them and take a note. To help you slightly, the game will outline the special citizen, usually in blue or orange. But as you can imagine, finding one person in what can be a large, sprawling city of thousands can sometimes be challenging. The bug was that I'm pretty sure it didn't actually generate the special citizens. There were meant to be 3, and usually in these quests 1 is quite easy to find, but I was unable to find any. As noted, it's a little worrying that something that is essentially coming over from previous games was quite so buggy. I would have hoped that what was essentially a repeated system would be a little more stable and that I would have been finding bugs in the new elements, but instead I mostly found elements in what should be core mechanics.
Steersman!
A fire broke out.
fire runs wild. Fight this inferno fast.
Let's put that shady job behind you now. Oh, me little lucky charm.
Attention for the Admiral.
Just like old times.
That blooming turnip was the size of her head.
Tell me you are moral, and not yet another crook-fingered wretch.
There be potholes, so watch out.
A check copy?
Graphics and performance. The game is, in my opinion, gorgeous. Anno has always been quite pretty,
really much
but
better at
1800 takes things to a new
self-editing
level. All of the footage you're watching is recorded at 4K with the quality set to ultra high. I did this more as a way of testing the game. I only have a regular GTX 1080 and it's not quite up to the job of 4K at max settings while also recording the game, and you can actually see there's quite a big lag as I move the cursor around and click on things. Just a note, after I'd recorded this footage, I turned the settings down to very high, and obviously played without recording as well, and things ran much better, and I couldn't tell much difference in the quality. One complaint I would make is that the GUI is way too big and takes up far too much of the screen. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any settings to scale the GUI, and I suspect it's as big as it is because my display settings are at 150% zoom. 4K can be a bit weird like that, and it's using this in the game. It's going to be a real pain if I have to keep adjusting the display settings manually before I play each time, and I've also some concerns that reducing the system zoom may make the text unreadable. If the GUI size isn't to do with my display settings, then it may be that Blue Byte are cheating the graphics quality a little bit by restricting the visible area, and therefore the graphical demand, by having a large GUI.
That fish pie smells gurtless.
Game saved. Fetid, festering filth.
Perhaps this island is as yet unclaimed?
Darling, bring your Paris hat.
My bannermen tread new soil, benevolent one.
If you be no pirate, you be prey.
New orders? Sails!
tourism and attractiveness. Another new concept introduced for 1800 and the industrialisation theme is tourism. This is quite an interesting addition, as it is one of the things that really arose as part of the industrial era. Companies such as Thomas Cook started offering organised trips and package holidays during this time, though 1800 is perhaps a bit early. I confess I didn't really explore this part of the game much at all. It appears to work by making an assessment of the attractiveness of each of your islands, which then impacts the number of tourists you draw to your island. My assumption is that these tourists will pay some sort of fee, or there is some appropriate mechanism for making money with them. It must presumably have some sort of benefit, otherwise why bother? This money could come from hotels, I guess, but I do know that there is the capability to build zoos on your islands, and I seem to recall mention of building something akin to the Great Exhibition. I would actually guess something like this probably forms the story for the main campaign, a race to building the Great Exhibition across a number of story missions perhaps? One thing I did find a little confusing was how it was making some of the assessments. Pollution, for example, seemed to be based simply on having a polluting building on your island. There didn't seem to be any sort of area of effect that meant you could tuck your industry away in a corner of your island and mean it had less impact. This would have been nice, as it would have given you the opportunity to have industry on multiple islands, rather than the implication here being that you have to specialise in having an attractive island to really maximise the benefits and then import all your industrial goods from other dirty islands. The reason I found this slightly confusing was that when I built an industrial building, the advisor popped up saying something along the lines of "no one likes to live next to a factory," implying there was some sort of area of effect thing going on. Something that is missing from this whole aspect appeared to be railways. Clearly, the railways were a huge part of the Industrial Revolution, but given goods are only moved over small distances in Anno, the game will actually complain that a building is not within range of a warehouse, rather than giving you the option to build a railway to deliver the goods across distance. I am, however, assuming that the later ships will at least be steam-powered, but whether they've gone as far as to require them to carry coal for fuel I would doubt. This isn't Factorio after all.
Game saved. A fire broke out. Your city has grown uglier.
Metal plows change things, I'll grant ye. But for better or for worse.
Your city has grown more beautiful.
Never tying the knot. Never.
More's the merrier.
Game saved.
Diplomacy. Diplomacy utilises a special screen in Anno 1800. I don't actually think this is new, as I seem to recall seeing something similar in the more recent games, but it's not a bad way to present your current status with the NPCs in the game. I did find things a little erratic though. In particular, when you undertake certain actions, such as flattery, the game gives you an indication of the likelihood of success. However, these seem to be wildly inaccurate. It would state something like highly likely, but then, when I tried, it failed. It did this multiple times and even showed inaccurate information of actions I'd already done. So it would say something was highly likely, then I would fail it, and it would again say it was highly likely, even though I'd just failed. This led me to believe it was some sort of major problem rather than a small bug. I also found the nature of relationships in the game a little confusing. It will occasionally pop up in a message saying your relationship with an NPC has apparently deteriorated over time, but it's difficult to get a feel for how big an impact this actually has, and there's no real indication of what's caused this deterioration. However, should diplomacy deteriorate significantly between you and the other NPCs, you do appear to be able to go to war with them, like you have in previous games. The status for the pirates started at war, though this only seemed to involve a minor naval threat, and I wasn't actually attacked by the pirates at any point. There was also the option to declare war on the other NPCs, though I didn't do this. Oddly, there didn't actually seem to be any non-naval military buildings in the game. Whether this is intended or not, I'm not sure. Certainly I would have expected some land-based combat units, red jackets and cannons perhaps, as this would have been in keeping with the era. Maybe they come later in the game. Not that combat has generally been all that interesting in Anno, but I think the option should be there, even if I personally will almost certainly play in a passive way. Something that does seem to have a big impact on NPC relations is the ability to buy shares in their islands. This is an interesting mechanic as it gives you the ability to take over an island passively. While I say it gives you this ability, the impression I got was that the NPCs would get angrier and angrier the more of their island you bought, and they would likely declare war on you anyway. What they can do to fight back in a passive way is rebuy the shares. At least I think they can do this. You can certainly rebuy the shares if they buy them in your island. The return on investment for the shares didn't actually seem all that good. I didn't look into it until quite late, which is why there's no footage, but it seems to be quite a large outlay for a relatively small continual return. Perhaps it does work out okay if you own them for a long time, and perhaps it gets better the larger the proportion of the island you own, or the bigger the population, for example. One thing I do want to say about it though is that it's a little backwards. In the real world, you sell shares to raise capital. They're not really something that you have to competitively guard against people buying. Well, I say that, hostile takeovers do exist, but in the context of the game, it would be weird that you would make 100% of the shares available to buy in this way. It's not part of a publicly listed fund after all. And I found that generally with some of the systems in the game. Take the need to have workers to make your production buildings operate. This is fine, but there is no punishment for workers not having jobs. In other words, the game sort of punishes you for creating jobs. The buildings won't work if there aren't enough workers, but it doesn't punish you for people not having work. The happiness isn't tied to their employment status. Indeed, they seem more than happy not to be working, and there's no social security system, so it's not clear how the workers are paying for the stuff they apparently buy. To some extent, 1404 seemed more realistic in this regard. That game had beggars who you could choose to feed and house, costing you resources, or leave to wander your streets. This would impact your citizens' happiness, but could also trigger crime and other negative events. This isn't really criticism as such, it's just it can feel a bit weird at times to be doing the opposite of what makes sense.
Maybe 3, 4 bushels. I wouldn't like to.
Someone lay hands on that cat.
fish pie smells gurtlush.
Up with a lark this morning, I was. More's the merrier.
Don't even mind the neighbors.
You're tying the knot. Never.
Throw it in the furnace.
Better doing this by hand.
Be there tonight at the union meeting.
Something.
Aye, aye.
Expeditions and multiple sessions. I mentioned before that the game has zoos for you to build, and if you're building zoos then you need to be able to fill them with exotic animals. I've also mentioned something about the New World. Both of these, collecting animals and colonising the New World, are enabled via expeditions. Previous Anno games have enabled you to build across multiple sessions. Famously, Anno 2205 let you build on the Moon as well as multiple spots on Earth, and here you can build in the Old World and New World. However, to discover the New World, you need to mount a successful expedition. Expeditions pop up as something you can undertake once you get artisans. I believe it's limited to this level because this is when you start to need the products that can only be produced in the New World. The expedition system plays out a lot like a choose-your-own-adventure game. You assign a ship from your fleet and stock it up with a few appropriate items. This fills up a morale meter based on what you've put on board. You also have the opportunity to equip items on the ship, which you will hopefully impact how you perform on the expedition. The game does give you hints on the type of events you will probably see on that expedition. The ship then departs, and once it's off the map, you will get the occasional pop-up where you are asked to make decisions. For example, you may encounter an event where the ship's cleric leads a mutiny. You are given options about how to respond. Let them go, arrest the cleric, try to persuade them to stay, for example, and these will have increased success chances depending on what you have available on board. Generally, each time you make one of these decisions, you will lose morale, and so you can impact your chances of success by ensuring the morale is as high as you can get it before the vessel sets off. Unless there's combat, I think. I didn't do any expeditions that involve combat, but I suspect your ship has to have some sort of combat capability for you to fight and win. Whether this involves an actual combat encounter, where you have to fight pirates for example, I don't know. One of the expeditions I did see would have had the crew setting off to capture a rare creature from the frozen north. This creature would obviously have populated the zoo, but as I had not built a zoo, I didn't bother doing it. One thing I would say I didn't like was the use of multiple sessions to implement the New World. The problem wasn't this fundamentally, it was more that there didn't seem to be any quick way to switch between the different islands. Each time you had to go to the world view, which meant a pretty but time-consuming zoom out, then you clicked where you wanted to go, and there was another pretty but time-consuming zoom in. It felt like these might have been hiding load screens, though they were quite quick loads if they were. Even if they were, I would have preferred an actual load screen. This would have allowed those of us with fast and powerful systems to switch quickly between the two. With the zoom in and zoom out, you now have to play both of those animations. Don't get me wrong here, there may be a way to quickly shift between the two, but I couldn't find it. I think the intent with these multiple sessions is that you're supposed to spend long periods in each world, where I tried to quickly switch between them, but then all I really did was explore around the map of the New World with the ship, which I preferred to do by clicking on a distant point and letting the ship open up the map for me. One of the things that makes this still work is that these sessions are clearly live while you're logged in. One world doesn't pause while you're logged on to the other world, for example. This is fine, but it means that if things happen in the other world, a fire starts or an NPC declares war, for example, you're going to need to switch between them, and then you've got this whole tedious zooming in and zooming out thing to do. The world map also flags the expeditions that you have available with big labels, and this was nice as it gave you a quick and easy way to see what was going on.
Filial duties weigh heavy. Can you share my burden? The chill already thaws.
Game saved.
Blueprinting. Another interesting addition to the game is a blueprinting system. I confess I was a little confused by this initially, mainly as I was thinking about it in terms of Factorio's blueprinting. I therefore thought perhaps that you laid down a bunch of buildings and then used a blueprint to copy them. So you might lay down, say, 8 houses with a road around them and copy this. But it doesn't work like that. It actually operates in 2 modes. The first, I've sort of dubbed the auto blueprinting mode, and this basically kicks in when you don't have enough material to build a building. Instead of not building it, the game places a ghost version of that building. Then, later on, when you have the materials, you can come back and click the button to build it, though you can also use the upgrade tool to achieve the same effect. I should note that it does require you to press the build button. It won't auto-build the building when the materials are there. This means you don't have to worry about the resources disappearing if you desperately need to build something else, for example. The second mode I think of as a full-on blueprinting mode. You switch the game into this mode, and now when you lay down buildings they are all placed as ghosts even if you have the material to build them. This second mode was a really cool addition in my opinion. It would, in theory, allow you to lay down an entire island's worth of stuff and to mess about with layouts without actually having to worry about having the materials or needing to satisfy the population needs. This is particularly beneficial in higher difficulty levels where you don't get resources returned to you in full when you destroy a building. So for example, if something takes, 5 wood to build, when you destroy it, you would only get 3 back. So in normal mode, you would be losing resources. In blueprint mode, you're sandboxing it so you don't lose any of those materials. The only problem I had with it, and it's a problem that's a fundamental issue for the game, is that you can only lay down blueprints for buildings you have unlocked. This often means you have to demolish things so you can fit other things in, which can be particularly annoying when you need to demolish a bunch of stuff to fit in a recently unlocked building that you need to cover your entire population with. In theory, the blueprint mode helps a bit with this, but again, you can't put down blueprints for buildings you haven't unlocked yet, so it can still be a bit of a pain.
A check copy?
Fresh this morning by yours truly.
Oh, impeccable timing, as always.
Game saved.
Are you open to trade?
Trading and trade routes. Interestingly, to be able to trade with NPCs, you have to agree trade rights with them, which you do via diplomacy. I believe this enables both buying and selling between you and the NPCs. Otherwise, you certainly can't buy and sell with the NPCs at their harbour without the agreement. There have been some tweaks to the way you set goods for sale in your harbours. You have to use a set of sliders, but it's now a much more clicks and sliders based affair, I assume to make it more friendly for people using controllers. I confess I personally found it a bit annoying. Just let me enter the numbers and use drop downs instead of the cycling through the options in each click way of doing things. I also found it a bit weird that cycling through the options, one of the options isn't no trade. In order to set no trade, you have to right click on the icon. This actually scuppered my playthrough a bit, as I accidentally set planks to be sold when I didn't intend to early in the game, and it meant my building materials were thin on the ground throughout. The use of icons rather than nice clear text meant I didn't really understand quite what was going on until much later. I thought I'd set it to no trade when actually it was set to buy and sell. Trade routes now use a dedicated screen. Actually, I think they have done for other games, but this one appears to have been refined somewhat, and I found it very easy to use. It was very easy to set up a trade route between my 2 islands, and it would look like it would be easy to set up trade routes both with NPCs and into the new world.
We assist however we may.
How we've longed to get back to the blue.
Overall, as discussed at the start, Anno 1800 is looking very interesting. It looks like a revisiting of the historical Anno games, but with the introduction of mechanics they've developed in the 2 intervening futuristic games, as well as some new concepts. I'm therefore definitely looking forward to its release, though I confess I'm going to wait for all reviews before I firm up purchasing. There's also a good chance I'll wait a few months to see if there's a price drop or if it goes on sale. Given the April release, I would strongly suspect that by the time the Steam Winter Sale rolls round, they'll do some sort of discount. I don't know why, but as Ubisoft seems determined to launch all of the Anno games as if they were on a par with the Assassin's Creed or Far Cry games. Let's face it, this type of builder management game, especially one with such an odd title, is a much smaller niche, and I really think they should start with a lower price and then simply keep it there.
As I pluck the goujeng in yearning.
Well, that's it for my Let's Try of the Anno 1800 closed beta. They have announced an open beta in March, I believe, if you want to give it a go yourself, and I'll probably be playing again then to get even better feel of the game. I don't know whether that will open up the full game. I suspect it may be limited to level 3 citizens again, but we'll have to see. So if you've been watching, I hope you've enjoyed it and you might consider coming back for another of my videos. I've been Trismegistus, this has been Anno 1800, thanks for watching. Cheers.